Welcome to the Resilient Schools podcast on the B Podcast Network. I am your host, Jethro Jones. You can find me on all the social medias at Jethro Jones. Today, I'm excited to have Joshua Stamper on the program. He's the Director of Innovation for the Teach Better team and manages the Teach Better Podcast Network. Prior to Josh's current position, he was a middle school administrator, classroom art educator, and an athletic coach. In addition to being on the Teach Better team, Joshua is the author of Aspire to Lead, a podcaster, leadership coach, and education presenter. Josh, welcome to Resilient Schools. Thanks for being here.
Oh my goodness, Jethro. It's such an honor to speak with you. I love your show. It's fantastic.
Well, thank you. And I had the great privilege of being on your show, Aspire to Lead, a couple weeks ago, and I just really appreciated that opportunity and was excited to bring you on this show as well. So, to you, from our conversation today, what do you think the big takeaway is for people?
Yeah, I think it was just dispelling misconceptions of restorative practices and how we can help our students in regards to trauma. I think it's very prevalent in our schools, and for us to rely on traditional practices, I think sometimes really does a disservice to our students, and trying to find some alternative and creative ways to help teach behavior instead of just punish.
Yeah, absolutely. The big thing for me that we didn't even go into detail about this, but you talked about teachers having a relationship with a student, and you said that the student is compliant in their classroom, and that teachers said that was a relationship. And we could probably spend a whole episode talking about just that piece, that compliance does not equal a relationship. But I think there's good stuff there, and maybe that's for our next episode. So, Josh, thanks for being here. We're going to get to my interview with Josh here in just a moment. So, Josh, I think I'd like to start out with talking about this idea of what people typically get wrong when it comes to restorative practices. What is something that you see that people usually don't get right when it comes to this? And I've got my thoughts, but I want to hear your thoughts first.
Yeah, so I've been doing this work for quite some time, and generally what folks think is that it's a kumbaya method, that we're all going to hold hands, circle up, sing songs, and then everything's going to be better. The other thing that I find is that folks also think that it's in replacement to consequences, and we have to really define what consequences mean. I think a lot of people default to their own experience and what they have seen as far as being a student, but then also being a teacher and administrator, which is defaulting to detention, in-school suspension, or out-of-school suspension. And when there's shift in that, then it's like, well, no, that's not how we do it, or that's not going to work. These are the only tools that we have to our disposal, and that's what we should be defaulting to. So I think those two components are probably the things that I dispel the most with folks, is that it's not a magic potion, it's not a silver bullet. I know that some folks have been frustrated, but they have to understand that when a person has gone through trauma, there's no quick fix. It takes time to build an environment that's going to be supportive, where trust has been built, and that student knows exactly what's going to go on within that learning space. And so I think consistency is huge, and then also making sure that we understand that when we put something in place and there are consequences that go with that, that the next day is not going to be a brand new child that comes into our classroom.
Yeah, I think that piece is really key, that it does take time, that it's not something that is going to change overnight or be fixed overnight. And the thing is, suspensions don't change or fix things overnight either. And we have some romanticized notion that they do, when in reality, they're not really that helpful. Let's talk a little bit more about consequences, because you said it's not a replacement for consequences, but it's often perceived as such. And so, what consequences go hand in hand with restorative practices that make sense? And again, I have my own thoughts, but I'll hear yours first.
Of course. So Jethro, I always talk about it as being something that's in repair of what was broken, right? And so obviously it could be a fracture in relationship, it could be a fracture in I actually physically broke something, or maybe I stole something, or maybe it's, a fight where, we had some conflict physically. And so with that, I always try to give permission to my admin and those who are doing restore practices to say, like, what is it that the student can do to fix or resolve what was broken in the past. And so I'll just give you an example of a situation. We had a student go into our library during the book fair, and he grabbed a book, threw it under his jacket, and walked out. Librarian saw it, ran after him, brought him to the front office, right? For a typical traditional discipline matrix, that student would be in ISS for probably multiple days because of that. So instead, what we did was we had myself, the librarian, and the student come and do a restorative circle, right? Get to the bottom of the root of the behavior and trying to figure out what was going on. In addition to that, there was a chance for the student to decide what was going to be repairing the situation, right? You took a book, so what are you going to do? So the student decided that he was going to volunteer his time before school for 2 weeks to help the librarian, with the book fair, and then also kind of being a secret shopper to make sure that other students weren't stealing books also. In that, I called the parent. She was shocked. She just assumed that he was going to be sent to ISS. Talked about what was done as far as the restore circle. There was a point where the student apologized on his own to the librarian. Then we, laid out the plan. She was enthused by it because she thought, well, actually, this is much longer of a stint of time, and she really wanted him to learn his lesson, right?
Yeah,
And
much more of a
so,
pound of flesh. Yeah.
right? So mom was upset because she's like, we have the money. I don't know why he's stealing. Well, what it came down to is he was just trying to show off to his friends, right? It was all about clout. He was trying to be popular with his peers. So he went every morning before school. And what happened was that he actually built a really strong relationship with the librarian. And beyond his time of 2 weeks, he actually would go out during lunch to the library and volunteer his time to take the books and put them back on the shelf and whatnot. So all that being said is because of that situation, if you look at it from the outside, teacher goes, "Oh, he stole a book and he's not an ISS. What's the deal? He got off scot free." But in turn, he was in the library every morning for 2 weeks, and in that, yes, he learned his lesson. He had a consequence, and he actually restored the relationship between him and the librarian. In addition to that, had a better relationship moving forward with that person, right? So all that being said is that some folks don't understand what that looks like. They don't see the back end of it. They didn't see the conversation that happened with the restorative circle in the front office between the librarian and the student. They don't hear the conversation with the parent. They also don't see sometimes the consequence that occurs. And then there's assumptions being made as far as, oh, they got off scot free.
So there are a couple of things that I want to address here. Number one, the suggestion by the offender is not always adequate for really restoring for the offended. And so, how do you bring in the offended to give them a chance to say, this is what I need in order to be whole?
Yeah, so part of that restore circle piece is that everyone has an opportunity to not only speak but to listen, right? And sometimes that restore circle needs to have additional folks brought in, right? Sometimes I had parents in a part of that conversation because I needed their not only their support but also, being a collaborative space to figure out what is it that needs to happen for this to be restored, right? To be fixed. And so, sometimes it was a counselor, sometimes it was a coach, so there was a lot of different folks that I would lean on and to try and find a resolution for every situation. And as you know, Jethro, every kid is different. Every situation is different. So I always hate the cookie cutter discipline matrix to say this offense equals this punishment because a lot of times that didn't work in the situation that I was working in. And so, yeah, a lot of times, when you first start a restorative circle, that student doesn't want to get in trouble. They're scared, there's fear, maybe there's anger, there's a lot of different emotions. And sometimes the output, as far as trying to be creative in that, needed some other folks to be brought in to figure out what that solution was going to be at the end.
So, one of the things we've talked about with previous guests is the idea of doing a circle. And that was with Rebecca Lewis Pancrantz, I believe. So just go to resilientschools.com, search for circles. You can learn more about setting up the circles, all the things that you need to do. I'm trying to get into the nuts and bolts here with Josh specifically. And so, Josh, with that, there's this idea that you mentioned that the librarian was happy because she got her pound of flesh. She got more time for to stick it to the kid, which I'm using that language intentionally because that's often how it feels. And the reality though is that it doesn't end up that way most of the time, that a relationship is actually improved or created or developed in that situation, what things need to be in place for that relationship to actually happen? Because it doesn't happen just because they happen to spend time together. He doesn't volunteer to go in there later just because he happened to be there in the morning. How do you get to that point of them being okay having that person in their space, being with them closely, and continuing that? Like, talk about the things that you need to do at administrative level to help those things happen as naturally as possible.
Yeah, I think there definitely has to be buy-in to understand that, a lot of times student behavior isn't personal. The things that they're doing isn't, he didn't steal that book to stick it to the librarian, right? And so thankfully we had been doing the work on that campus for multiple years as far as restorative practices and talking about, how trauma has affected our students and some of the things that we need to work on within the restorative circles. So this wasn't a foreign concept to the librarian. Kudos to her for not taking it personal. She did appreciate the help before school, so that's, I think, why she got excited. But I think understanding that, there were some things going on in this child's life, and our staff understanding that, you know we have seen a lot of kids go to ISS and the behavior is the same, if not worse. So why would we continue to do the exact same thing expecting a different result? That would just be ridiculous, right? So sometimes we had to remind our staff, like, ISS shouldn't be the default, right? There needs to be other things in place, but then also like having training for our staff to understand, like, we do need to build relationships with our students. It's very important. Even if they did something incorrectly, we still need to know them at a human level, and some of that was actually creating prompts for them. So, we can't assume too, like, our staff comes in and just knows how to build relationships with their kids. A lot of times our teacher would be like, yeah, I have a great relationship with them. But it really was, this student is compliant in my classroom. I know their name. I know maybe a sport that they play. But as far as going any deeper than that, that didn't really exist. So we had to really kind of teach our staff as far as how to get our students to understand, like, connections between the teacher and themselves, and then also themselves with their peers. And so, doing brain breaks and relationship circles and other activities within the classroom to kind of start opening that up. So I would say that if you're starting out and you're trying to make this happen, it's going to be more difficult than 3, 4 years into that process of trying to get everybody on the same page and having that mindset of trying to fix versus just punish.
Yeah, and like on that piece, the first talk that I gave on restorative practices or resilient schools was, I said something in there about how to start this process, and one of the key things I said was don't take it personally. That the behavior that kids have, you can't take it personal. And I remember someone in the audience came up to me afterward and said, "You can't tell teachers to not take it personally." And I was like, "Oh, are you taking it personally?" But seriously, you can't take it personally because most of the time the behavior has nothing to do with you. And when it does have something to do with you, even still, it's not worth it to take it personally. Even when somebody is just like, I hate this teacher or this principal, and I'm going to do this on purpose to attack them, that is not what typical people do. And so there is something causing them to feel like that is an okay response. And that is really challenging for someone to deal with, for sure. But you still can't take it personal. What's your advice to help people see that they can't take this thing that they put so much time and energy into, that they can't take it personally?
It's difficult, Jethro. I mean, I can think of personal examples of myself taking things personal when I was completely wrong. The kid, most of the students, they're not thinking about us outside of school, and so there's always an underlying reason for the behavior. And so we talked about that a lot. I talk in conferences and with school districts called the language of behavior, right? And what he's talking about is, like, behavior is a language. So we got to decode it and figure out what's at a deeper level because there's something going on. As you said, Jethro, like, some of the behaviors, for instance, like if a kid's running down the hallway, you tell them to stop and they tell you to F off. That's not a normal behavior. It's that, like, 99% of the students are going through the hallways and will not do that action. So, like, that student in that situation, there's obviously something deeper that we need to get to the bottom of. Obviously there needs to be a consequence for that action, but at the same point there's some additional resources and teaching that needs to occur, and that we as an educational community need to figure that out. So it is very hard. We're in a people business, and when you spend so much time with these students for a full year or 9 months, it's like a family. They know how to push your buttons. They know how to get under your skin. They know how to irritate you because of the amount of time in that classroom. So it makes sense. It's something that we just have to continue to remind folks that, there is something deeper here going on, and we just have to spend a little bit more time getting to the bottom of it to make sure that we're remedying that.
I remember having a conversation with the teacher and basically saying something to the effect of, stop being so conceited. Nobody is thinking about you outside of when they are in your classroom. And she was like, what? How dare you say something like that? And I was like, do you go home and think about me? And she's like, no. I said, do you go home and waste your time thinking about your students and how they're like stressing you out? And she's like, well, yeah, I do. I think about like what I can do to reach them. And I said, do you think about how you can get back at them or like do something to hurt them and point out their flaws? She's like, no, of course not. I said, nobody else does either. Like, why are you thinking that these kids are like plotting and scheming to hurt you? They don't care about you that much. And if they did care about you enough to spend time thinking about you, then they would be thinking positively like you are about them. And she was like, offended at first and then totally understood, like, okay, this is real and maybe they're not always thinking about me, but because they came into her class and they just turned into different people. She even said that, and that was part of the thing that made it so powerful, is she's like, they're different people, they turn into different people when they come in. And it's like, oh well, then there's something going on in your room that's making them feel this way. I promise you, they are not thinking about you at all outside of class. And she was like, she just couldn't believe it. But that idea that it was all about her was very real to her in the moment. And once she understood that it wasn't all about her, she was able to move on and actually start working on fixing those relationships and taking advantage of the time that she had with them in her classroom, rather than thinking that they were, scheming and out to get her outside of the classroom. So let's talk about that piece a little bit. What are the things, you said after 3 or 4 years, this becomes easier. What are those things that need to happen that lay the groundwork for restorative practices to work?
Well, I think the first piece is that proactive component, right? So getting at the root of what's going on in the classroom. I think it's funny because I was shaking my head when you were giving that example, because I've had that happen before where, the teachers are like, this X, Y, and Z student is different in my classroom than in their science class or their history class. And I was like, well, then go visit that class. Like, obviously something's happening in that environment and there's some procedures that are in place that are being successful. So why wouldn't we adopt that into our own classroom to make sure that we're modeling the exact same environment in both spaces, right? And sometimes it's the mix of kids, and there's a lot of other variables sometimes. But for us, I was talking about the relationship circle. I was talking about making sure that we had brain breaks where they got to connect with other folks. The other thing that we implemented was relationship plans, essentially. So it was like student to teacher and teacher to student. So what does that look like as far as our classroom norms, and agreeing upon that? And then, if you wanted to get fancy with it, sometimes they would blow it up, have all the kids sign it, and it would be posted somewhere. So it has to be posted, it has to be something that you're constantly looking at and bringing up and modifying too. It's not set in stone. For instance, if cell phones become a issue in the classroom and the kids think that should be something that's a norm that's placed up on the relationship agreement, then you would modify that and you'd repost it back up. We saw a lot of success in that. The other thing too was like looking at the data as an administrator. What we found was thousands of hours, literally, were wasted in ISS where they weren't with the content expert. And so it was always funny to see teachers shocked by the data when students didn't do well in state testing. It's like, well, look at how much time they've actually spent in the classroom versus out of the classroom. And then if you look even deeper, it was on low level infractions, right? So it's like a disruption in the classroom or insubordination or something like that. So we were saying, and we adopted this from another school, was what if we did something where it was called a push in? And for that situation, it was allowing a counselor, administrator, or coach, someone to come in and relieve the teacher. So the teacher then has a conversation with the student on the hallway on a walk. And the reason we did that was because a lot of times, Jethro, and you probably know this as a former administrator, is that a kid would act up, get sent out of class, then the administrator would build a better relationship with that student because they spent time with them. They were trying to decipher what's going on and became the middleman. And then there was a lot of tension that was going on because the student was fine with the administrator, but still had a fractured relationship with the teacher. And then, of course, the student goes back to the classroom the next day, and that fracture still exists. And so there's hostility there. And so what we tried to do is alleviate all that and make sure that the teacher was having the chance to, because that's all the teachers wanted. They wanted to figure out what was going on. They wanted the student back in the class. There's not too many teachers that are like, get out and stay out. I never want you to come back again, right? Especially on a low level infraction. So we were able to shave off literally hundreds of hours of time just for the teacher to have 3 to 5 minutes to just figure out, hey, what's going on, right? Okay, your parents were fighting all night last night and you got an hour of sleep. Maybe there's an understanding here that, can have a break every once in a while. And just let me know, right? No, we did check-ins too. That was another thing that was huge, was trying to figure out what's going on in the lives of our students so that we can give the resources that are needed, in that situation. So if a kid only got an hour of sleep, is there an opportunity for that kid to maybe take a nap? God forbid we provide basic needs to the student, right? Or hey, this child didn't eat for a whole 24 hours and he's starving, right? So maybe let's get him a meal so that way he can get through his day. So check-ins were huge for us too, especially as mental health is decreasing and students are having suicidal thoughts and some other ideations. We were able to get resources to them at the beginning of the day instead of finding out later when potentially they're trying to take action.
Yeah, that's really good. And the other thing is about those push-ins, you're going to be spending that time as the administrator anyway. You're going to be tied up not able to do anything else. So
Yeah.
rather than spend 20 minutes trying to get a kid calmed down, get them to divulge what's really going on, build the relationship with them, why not let the person that they had the conflict with, that they're going to see more often than you anyway, why not have them build that relationship with that person? I think that's a great strategy that we implemented in our schools as well. And you know front loading that kind of thing with check-ins and saying, look, I know I'm going to be spending 2 hours with this kid every day. I might as well do that in the morning first thing, and then send them to class in a better frame of mind, ready to go, so that when something does happen, then they have a chance to like come back and talk to me about it, because I've already said, hey, you're going to have a rough time today. I can tell because of how you came into my office. So when you need a break, like, let's chat, let's figure out a way to get you the support that you need, so that you're not doing something that's going to damage your relationships, put you in a discipline situation, and make your life overall miserable. That's not what anybody wants. And on that subject of time, that's one of the major complaints about restorative practices, is that it takes time, because it does. And getting all the right people in the
Yep.
room, that takes a lot of time. How do you address the issue of it just takes time?
So I think, Jethro, what you were talking about before too is like you're gonna be spending time on student discipline and behavior regardless, right? So how much do you want to spend? Do you want to spend it on the front end or do you want to spend it on the back end, right? And for me, like trying to do an investigation, sending a kid ISS or OSS, and then having them come back and then it just become a cycle over and over, I can assure you that's going to take way more time by the end of the school year because nothing's been resolved than doing the restorative practices. So I would rather go into a circle and get everybody that I need to as far as that collaborative space and trying to figure out, how to teach the student the correct behavior and emotionally regulate and how to go through adverse situations in the front part of the school year and hopefully, like I said, build these skills for them so that at the back end of the school year, I'm not having to deal with the same issues, right? But if I'm just throwing a kid in ISS or OSS, honestly, that doesn't, it's not teaching them anything, right? It's just essentially it's a fear-based discipline. And so as we see in data and as most of us know, like that's not going to change a lot of the folks, especially if the student's been through trauma. So whenever I hear about time, it's like, yeah, it does take time and you can't do it alone. I've tried, it can't be done, right? So I had to find other people. I leaned heavily on my campus with my counselors. I leaned heavily on those people who wanted to become administrators someday. Every year I had between 3 and 5 teachers that had gone through their master's program or were going through their master's program and they wanted to learn about how to be an administrator. Well, you need to know about student discipline, right? So I always had a team of people. We had a relationship action team that was created where these were key components to the restorative practices. So I would lean on them heavily to say, okay, this is what needs to happen. Will you please lead this restorative circle with, this person, the student? And they would be able to facilitate that and, communicate to those who needed. So to say, okay, I have 1,500 students on my campus and I'm going to do every restorative circle, that's just asinine. That can't happen. So I had my, SEL clerk who, which was our ISS back in the day, reforms. They were also trained, so they knew how to run a restorative circle. So like I just had a whole group of folks that knew and was trained about this work and that I could lean on and really delineate what needed to be done because I tried and failed at trying to do it all myself. So I had to, bring other folks into that process.
So you mentioned earlier about the language of behavior. You've got a book coming out on
Mhm.
that same topic. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the language of behavior as a whole and where to get your book when it comes out?
Oh my goodness. So I have the wonderful privilege of writing with Charlie Pack. She is an amazing educator. She's speaking all over the country, and she also has another book out on more on mental health. But yeah, we're partnering to create the language of behavior where it's really talking about just trauma, how it affects the students as far as their brain, their emotional well-being, whatnot. And then also, as far as a school, what can we do to one, decipher what's going on within the behavior? Because it's really hard. If a kid is eloping from the classroom and hiding in the bathroom, like, yes, it's an odd behavior, but there's something also behind that, right? So once we are figuring out what's going on in the life of the student, what are we doing on campus? So it's really, as far as Charlie's background as a social worker, mine as an administrator, what were things that we implemented into our schools to benefit the whole student body, but then also to make sure that we're identifying what's going on in the lives of our kids and making sure that we have things in place, like I said before, to teach them the correct behavior, how to regulate their emotions, but then also be in tune with what's going on in their life. Because I don't know about you, Jethro, but some of my eighth graders, they looked like they were married, they had kids, and they were driving to school. But they were so immature and they didn't have the skills to be able to go through stressful situations. And it was very prevalent. But a lot of times, teachers and administrators just assumed because of how they looked that they possessed those skills. And so, it's just going through of talking through like the relationship action team that I built and how we implemented things on our campus and really getting the nitty gritty for folks to be able to use these strategies, implement them, and understand that it's not going to happen overnight, that it's years of work that goes into that, but just how the shift and the change in the culture of these strategies really help the campus.
They really do. And that's the powerful thing is that behavior is another language, another way for people to communicate. And if we can take a little bit of time to learn what that looks like, I think we're gonna be in good shape. You brought up this idea of kids looking older, therefore looking like they have the skills that we think they should have. And this is one of the major mistakes that we make in education all the time. My nephew is adopted from Samoa and he is a big kid and he's the same age as my daughter, but he is like probably a foot taller at least already and bigger, and you just forget so quickly that he's
Yeah.
only 6, 10, 12, whatever age he happens to be at the time. You forget so quickly that he's just a little kid. And he may look a lot older and a lot bigger, but it's so easy to just to assume that he's older. And it's a mistake that we often make, and through no fault of our own. It's just, we're around people who look like this. And so we think they have these skills and they just don't. And then when you add in trauma to that, that can stunt their growth and their development as well. That makes it really challenging. Also, and you may not see the things that prove that they're not quite as old maturity wise as they may look. And I think that's just something that we need to remember and pay attention to. So, Josh, would you share how people can learn more from you and get in touch with you and connect with the work that you do?
Yeah, of course. So My website is joshstamper.com, and if you want to learn more, I've got several blogs on there. And actually, I wrote them with my wife. So we were foster parents for 12 years. So my wife has kind of written more on the parent side of things, and I'm definitely talking about the admin side. But I think there's a lot of overlap with that, and we just talk about a lot of times just the trauma, what that looks like, but then also the fact, like Jethro, you had said, sometimes the maturity level is literally cut in half. So if you have a 12-year-old, they probably are looking like a 6-year-old as far as the behavior and some of the things that they're working with. And that's just one of the aspects of trauma in life. So joshstamper.com, social media, Joshua_Stamper. So Twitter/X or Instagram. You can follow me there, or you can just email me at joshua@teachbetter.com. Love to answer any questions you have.
Yeah, very good. Thank you so much for being here. And in the show notes at resilientschools.com, I've got your link to your website. And so people can definitely go check that out. And thank you so much for being here and for sharing your wisdom with the Resilient Schools podcast.
Oh my goodness, Jethro, it was an honor to speak with you today. Thank you so much.